Couple things before we get started here. The first is I put up an announcement, those extra CL sessions tonight. So it's essentially like an additional week, even though there won't be any on Monday, right? You have extra credit opportunities if you attend the CL sessions tonight, and I put the room locations and times in this announcement. So every time slot has 2 locations as opposed to the usual 3. These will be the ones where you can go and ask it's essentially like a review, like you can go ask questions. They're not going to have anything like the usual CL sessions where they're going to work through it, but if you have questions, you can go there to ask and they'll kind of help you work through them. Okay. And as long as you attend one, you would get that additional 0.15 points of extra credit. Okay. So once these are passed, I've instructed them to try to upload their attendance tonight. So I will try to upload the CL points tomorrow to Canvas. So that should be completely accurate and reflective of all the CL sessions up to this point. Right now, it should be capturing everything that we've done, but I'll try to get them updated to include tonight's additional CL sessions as well. So you'll kind of have your grade there tomorrow. The only other thing that we have left, so every other category, your grade on Canvas should be the final grade in that category you see, with the exception of we've got, where's it at? That 5th and final Canvas discussion, which is due at the end of the day tomorrow, right? If you haven't done that, these should be easy points. I'm hoping most of you have already done this. If you haven't, get on and get that done, because if you do it after the due date tomorrow, it's going to count as a 0, right? And I say tomorrow, at the end of the day tomorrow, 11:59 p.m., okay? So once that due date passes by Monday, in fact, after that, I've had my TAs will hopefully have all these graded by Monday. So going into that final, you'll know what your score is in every single category. You'll know your final CL points. If you wanted to, I mentioned this on Tuesday as well, you can use that hypothetical grade tool in Excel, plug in what your grade is in each one of those categories, and then play around with what your hypothetical final exam score is to see what your final grade in the class would be, okay? Other than that, I don't have good news about my office hours Monday. I won't be there in person. So yesterday was kind of the last office hours that were available. I'm going to try to carve out some time on Monday afternoon. So look for an announcement on Canvas about the possibility of having some virtual office hours where I have that same Zoom link open. It would likely be Monday afternoon. If you have any last minute questions, if you have questions you want to email me from now until the final exam, I will try to get them to respond to them as quickly as possible. If you send me emails on Tuesday, the day of the final, I make absolutely no guarantees I'll get to you because I have earlier exams in that day. I've got some other scheduled meetings. I won't be able to keep a real good eye on my email up until when that exam starts, okay? So if you have a question, try to get it to me sooner rather than later, definitely before Tuesday, okay? Because the other announcement I posted on Canvas since last class, here we go, is about the final exam. And I think I mentioned this in class on Tuesday, but just so that you have a point where you can go back and reference it. Our exam is going to be in Hodge Hall next Tuesday, the 16th of December from 5:20 to 7:20 p.m. Okay. So try to get there early, right? So it starts at 5:20. I would plan on trying to get there at least 15 minutes early. I have another section taking the exam at the same time down in the first floor of Hodge. I'm going to drop off exams, get my proctor set up there, and then I will start the exam with you guys, right? So there's a slight technicality there. The majority of you will be in this 2075 room. So everyone with a last name A through U, you'll go to room 2075. If you have a last name that starts with V through Z, you're going to be in a room right next to us, which is very large as well. But I didn't want to kind of have it equally split. I only have so many proctors. There's going to be one proctor there. So there'll only be about 25 students in that room. If you're in that second room, 2083, also if you're in 2075, try to sit as close to the front as possible, right? That makes it easier on the proctor to kind of get those exams handed out quickly, which gives you guys more of that 2-hour time block to be able to take the exam, right? So if your last name starts with V through Z, you'll be in that additional room where there'll only be about 25 students. Sit as close to the front as possible. I'll start the room out in the main section, 2075, with the vast majority of you. I've got 3 other proctors who will help me get those handed out. Once the exam everyone's got an exam, the only thing you should have out during the exam, the only thing you should have out once the exam starts is what? something to write with, a pencil or preferably black ink pen, right? Don't use color pens, right? And a non-graphing calculator. Once the exams are handed out, if you want additional blank paper, I will have some. Me or one of the proctors will kind of help get some of that handed out right away. Once we get the exam started, I will likely go down to the first floor to check on my other sections, right? And then throughout the exam, I'll be kind of between those rooms, right? So if you have any question at any point during the exam, raise your hand. If I'm not in the room, the proctors will probably come by and answer it as best they can. If they're not sure how to answer your question, specifically without giving you the answer, they might tell you to wait for me. If that's the case, move on to the next question. And once I'm back in the room, they will either let me know or make sure you kind of raise your hand and I can kind of make sure I go and answer your question once I return to the room. So I'll be kind of spread a little bit thin, but I should try to stay like in every room for 10 to 15 minutes, move to the next one, so on and so forth. Okay. Some other things I want to mention about the exam before I forget, and I didn't put in the announcement, and I'll probably post up another announcement that just clarifies this. Once you're done, you're free to leave, right? So if you're worried about wanting a lot of the time and you're worried about people getting up and down and leaving and just try to, where should you try to sit if you think you're going to be there for the whole 2 hours? In the middle of a row, right? So once you're done, you're free to leave. Go and hand the exam at the front. When you hand the exam in, you will need to show them your Crimson card, whether that's a physical version or I'm not sure if you're the first class where it's all virtual. So don't pull that up. There's also a spot on the exam where it asks you for your Canvas ID. That's simply the first part of your IU email address. It also has a part where it asks you for your Canvas, or not Canvas, your IU ID number. If you don't know it off the top of your head, you can wait until you hand the exam in, show them your Crimson card, and then write that number down as you're turning the exam in. Do not pull your phone out before you get up to the front to turn your exam in. Otherwise, what am I think you're going to be doing? Or if I'm not there, the proctors will think, and they might take your exam, right? So the only time you should have your phone out is as you're turning the exam in, just to look up or show that digital Crimson card, or to kind of look up that ID number, okay? Any other logistical questions for me about the exam before we kind of dive into kind of review material here today? Yeah. Yeah, so I think I might have mentioned this before. How many questions are on there? Yeah, so there's a few more questions. So there's going to be 30 questions, so a little bit longer. But instead of an hour and 15 minutes, you have 2 hours. So you're going to have more time per question. But very similar format to the other exams. Those practice finals should give you a good idea about what the types of questions and kind of the structure and format of those questions will look like. But yeah, 30 questions, 2 hours to complete it. Okay. There will likely be a bonus question on there as well. So there might be 31 bubbles you have to fill in. Okay. So there won't be an equation sheet on this exam. Any equations that you need to know are going to be something that you have to kind of have memorized. Okay. So exam 2, we were starting out using those equations. So I gave it to you. From here, we don't have as many equations that you would need. Also, we've been using them more for a longer period of time. And so you're not going to have an equation sheet, right? Which is why I didn't post one. Any other questions logistically before we jump into kind of material here? Okay. All right. Also, before I forget to mention, I'm hoping that I will have those graded relatively quickly. So I should try to get those final exam scores out Wednesday. But final grades, I likely won't have posted until later in the day on Thursday next week. So I'll try to get as quick of a turnaround I can for those final exam scores and final grades to show up on campus. Okay. Other than that, any other questions before we jump into review here for today? And let me make sure I hit record here. Okay. All right. So any questions people want to see worked through here? Yeah. So the module 12 quiz, question number 9, you said? Yeah. So module 12, we were looking at game theory. So question 9. Oh, come on. Something like this, right? Yeah. So I'll write this out. So we got 1, and then I'll kind of switch over. So when we have these kind of decision tree examples, this is when we have sequential decision making. So one person is making a decision, and then the other person gets to observe that decision, and they make their choice second. So if we have these payoffs, right? I'm not trying to trick you, and it'll usually kind of denote this in the problem itself, but we're always kind of writing person 1, or here it's politician 1, their payoffs on their left, politician 2 or person 2, the person going second, their payoffs will be on the right, okay? So here's kind of our, I guess I ran out of room here, right? But here was that decision tree. Here's how I would go through and solve these problems if it were me, right? So person 2 is the person making the decision second. Their payoffs are on the right, or the second payoffs given to you. Person 1, they're making the decision first. Their payoffs are on the left, right? And I think the decisions we had here was like, do I run positive or negative ads, right? Just kind of shorthanding there. So when I have these decision tree examples, I will first solve it using the person going second. So I'm going to use what we call backward induction. I'm going to start with the person going second, figure out their best response, and then go and figure out what person 1's best response would be to that. So if I was on this, if I have the physical version of the exam, I would do this with my hand. If I'm on this branch of the tree, person 2, what should they choose to do? If the higher number is better, is losing 1,000 votes preferable to losing 3,000? Yes, right? It's a kind of smaller negative value. Likely will just give you positive values just to make it a little bit easier on the exam. So here we have that they're choosing to run positive ads. So we know that if we end up on this branch, person 2 will never choose this option. If we instead saw person 1 run negative ads, what will person 2 do? Was losing 2,000 votes better or worse than gaining 2,000? Well, gaining 2,000 is better. So we know that if we're over on this branch, we'll never see person 2 do this. So we now have person 2's best responses to both of player 1 or politician 1's possible choices. So politician or person 1 says, if I run positive ads, I know person 2 will run positive ads and I'll gain additional 1,000 votes. If person 1 chooses negative ads, person 2 will run positive ads and person 1 loses 2,000 votes. Which of these is better? Right? Gaining 1,000 instead of losing. So here, our best response from each individual leads us to this Nash equilibrium, or the branch of the tree that has 2 circles, less technical way of saying that, is going to be where they both run positive ads. Okay? So that's how I would go through and solve these kind of decision tree examples. We first solve what the second player is going to do for both scenarios. I think what makes it easy is then the decision that they don't choose, just cross that out. You don't have to worry about those payoffs anymore. You then go to the person who's choosing first and say, okay, now if I choose this option, I know this would be the outcome. If I choose this option, I know this would be my outcome. Which of those is better? And you can identify what payoff is higher there. Okay? Any questions on this one before we keep moving? Yeah, so when we have these decision trees, we will always have at least one Nash equilibrium, right? We could technically end up with multiple. What would have to be true for me to have multiple equilibrium here? The payoffs for person 1 from both scenarios would have to be the same, right? They'd be indifferent about which we were in. But we can't have no equilibrium with these decision tree games. Yep. Now, this wouldn't be the case. This would change maybe the Nash equilibrium, but just to make a point, would this Nash equilibrium be an example of a prisoner's dilemma? So I could ask you about a prisoner's dilemma from a normal form game or these extensive form games. The definition of a prisoner's dilemma is we end up with a Nash equilibrium where there's another combination of strategy choices where both people are better off. So here, would we both be better off over here? No. Would we both be better off here? No. Would we both be better off here? There's a negative sign out front here, so no, right? So this would not be an example of a prisoner's dilemma. Now let's just assume that we had these numbers over here. I think this would actually give you the same Nash equilibrium if I'm looking at this quickly off the top of my head, right? So if we end up with this Nash equilibrium, but this was a possible option over here, would I have an example of a prisoner's dilemma? Yes, because now my Nash equilibrium results in the payoffs to both individuals being lower than a different combination of strategy choices. Right? Before, that wasn't the case. But if these were the values, I would still end up with the same Nash equilibrium, but I now have an example of a prisoner's dilemma. Okay? So we can identify a prisoner's dilemma from our matrices or our normal form games where people are making simultaneous decisions. We can also have an example of a prisoner's dilemma if we're making them sequentially. Okay? Other questions on this one? Any other questions people want to see? Yeah. So sometimes if you just look, if I gave you 2 practice exams and in both of them, I did it like this, how do you think I'm going to probably do it in the final? Probably do it like this. Yep. Okay. Yeah. For a monopoly? Yeah. So, do you have a question in mind or just that in general? Okay. Okay. So, in 14, on the first practice exam that I posted, so there we were looking at, consumer surplus and thinking about comparing that to a perfectly competitive market. We could do the same thing for if we were looking at total surplus, producer or consumer, or deadweight loss. So let's do all of them, right? Might as well just be safe. We could answer a question on any of them, right? So if I've got a monopolist, they face the entire demand curve, and they're going to make a decision based off of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Okay? So here's my marginal cost curve. I then think about how does a monopolist choose the profit maximizing quantity? This is every firm. They should choose the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, right? So the monopolist is down here. They then do what to set the price? They go up to our demand curve, okay? So we could think about what is consumer surplus here. It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to the consumer. If we were to look at producer surplus, it's that same definition, but the benefits and costs to consumers and producers are going to be different. What represents the marginal benefit to the consumer? That's represented by our demand curve. What is the marginal cost to the consumer? When you buy something, the cost to you is the price you pay. So with a monopolist, our consumer surplus is the difference between the demand curve and the price they pay, right? And here we're kind of thinking about this as a single price monopolist, right? They were setting a single price. Where would producer surplus be? Well, what is the marginal benefit if I'm selling something? The price, right? The more responsive you guys are, the more questions we'll probably get through, right? I'm not just going to have to wait for an answer. So what represents the marginal cost curve? Well, the marginal cost curve, right? So producer surplus is the difference between the price and the marginal cost up to the quantity the monopolist chooses. So here I've got my producer surplus for a single price monopolist. What would total surplus be? Well, it's just the combination of consumer and producer surplus, so it would be this area here. So what did we lose out on, right, by the fact that we had a monopolist? Where would the perfectly competitive market end up? Where supply is equal to demand, right? So when we're talking about deadweight loss, we're always comparing to a perfectly competitive market, because a perfectly competitive market is where total surplus is maximized, right? So what represents our supply curve in this graph? A firm's marginal cost. So if this was a perfectly competitive market, where would supply be equal to demand? Out here. So what surplus did we miss out on? Well, total surplus, once again, difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs, but it's for the entire market, right? It's not consumers or producers, it's the entire market. What represents the marginal benefits? Demand. Marginal cost is our supply curve. So the fact that the monopolist produced fewer units, what did we miss out on surplus-wise? That entire area in between the supply and demand curve, up to the point where, or up to the quantity where the perfectly competitive market would choose. So here was kind of our deadweight loss for a single price monopolist. So I think like on 14, it wasn't just asking us to identify consumer or producer surplus, which we could do from a graph. If I gave you values here, you could actually report to me the actual producer or consumer surplus or deadweight loss values. But if we're just thinking about directional changes, and here we could draw a graph next to it just so we don't have as many things going on. If I had the same marginal cost, same demand curve, where would the perfectly competitive quantity be? Well, we said marginal cost would represent the supply, so we'd be out here. But the price of a perfectly competitive market is simply that point where supply is equal to demand. So what is consumer surplus for the perfectly competitive market? The difference between our demand curve, but now the price that the perfectly competitive market ends up at. So consumer surplus would be right here. So for sure, what's happened to consumer surplus with a monopolist? It's went guys, if I have a small triangle here, and instead I'm now looking at this lower price and I have this large, what has happened to consumer surplus with a monopolist? It's lower, right? So the consumer surplus from these single price monopolists, sorry, I don't know why I wrote CS here. I meant perfectly competitive, will be less than that of a perfectly competitive market. Now, this one might be a little bit trickier, all right? What is producer surplus in this perfectly competitive market? The difference between now the price of a perfectly competitive market and our marginal cost curve. So we lost a small triangle if we had a monopoly market, but we gained this large rectangle. So when it comes to producer surplus, a single price monopolist, the producer surplus is actually greater than that of a perfectly competitive market, right? Because even though we lose a little bit of surplus here, a lot of consumer surplus was now transferred to producers, okay? So, and this intuitively makes sense. If I have a monopoly market, who is that going to be a good thing for? Well, if they set a higher price, that's a good thing for the firms or producers. Producer surplus goes up. Who is it a bad thing for? Consumers. Consumer surplus goes down, right? And then we had some surplus that was just lost. That was our deadweight loss. Now, technically, if I asked you for the directional change, what is the deadweight loss for a perfectly competitive market? Yeah, you held up. There is no deadweight loss. That's always our comparison when we're actually thinking about if there is debt, right? This is where total surplus is maximized. So deadweight loss of a single price monopolist will always be greater than the deadweight loss for a perfectly competitive market because it actually exists, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah. Did I see another hand somewhere as I was going through this? So are there any other questions on this one before we keep moving? No? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so if I'm asking you about natural monopolies, once again, pattern recognition, especially now that you have 2 final exams, probably goes a long way. So if I come up here, I'm talking about a natural monopoly in question 10, and here I've got, where is it at? 15 is talking about this as a natural monopoly, right? So with these natural monopolies, kind of the main question that you're going to see, which popped up on both of these, is what happens when I try to regulate them, right? So I'll use this example because the picture is a little bit bigger and easier to follow. Oh, sorry. Someone should have told me that. So we have question 15 on the one practice exam, second practice exam, question 12. Very similar, just different values. I'm going to use this one because it's a little bit easier, I think, for you guys to see, and we have multiple points. So if this was a monopolist, where are they going to set the profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I then do what to set the price? Go up to the demand curve. So the price they set, they'll produce 18 units, and they're going to set a price of 60. Price is above my average total cost, so profits will be positive, right? Just to kind of add some things in here as we're working through, because it could be other questions that might pop up. What would the markup of this natural monopolist be? So what is our markup? It's the difference between the price and marginal cost is the specific definition. So our price we were setting was 60. At that profit maximizing quantity, our marginal cost value was 10. So the markup was 50, the difference between the two. Okay. Now let's think about if this was a perfectly competitive market. They wouldn't make a decision based off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. We would see that the firm ends up at a quantity where what is equal to what? Supply is equal to demand, which what represents supply? The marginal cost of the firm. So the perfectly competitive market, although it's not a specific value, ends up out here like somewhere between 32 and 34. But the price that would result looks like a price of 20. Now, what happens if we try to regulate this natural monopoly and we set that price at 20? What is true about that price of 20 if I just imposed a price ceiling relative to my average total cost? It would be below. So if I regulate and I force this price from what, 60 all the way down to 20, price is now below average total cost. Profits for this firm would be, what are they going to do? If they exit the market and they're a monopolist, how many firms are left? What do I lose? Everything. Deadweight loss is not minimized by setting the price at 20. Deadweight loss would actually be maximized, right? So how far can I lower the price until the firm chooses to leave? They'll choose to stay as long as price is above or equal to average total cost. If it was equal, profits would be 0. We'd say they're indifferent. So in practice, this wouldn't be something I ask on the exam. But if I know that profits are 0, they might stay or they might leave, they're indifferent. What might I want to do? Set the price just like a penny above that, right? But if we're just thinking about theoretically, how far could I push that price down? It's to be where profits would be equal to 0. So what if I lower the price to 50? At that price, would the price be above or below average total cost? So profits are still positive, so they'll stay, and I've reduced deadweight loss, right? What if I push the price down to 40? They'll still stay. Profits are still positive, prices, and I've reduced even more deadweight loss, right? Because how am I reducing deadweight loss? I'm getting closer to that quantity a perfectly competitive market would end up at, right? By lowering the price, I'm moving away from this point of 60 and a quantity of 18, getting closer to that quantity of about 33. Now, the problem is if I keep lowering the price, once I get to 30, what's true about my profits? Price is equal to average total cost, so profits are 0. The firm here is indifferent about staying. That's the lowest possible value I could lower the price to. If I go any lower than 30, price is now below average total cost, and the firm would. So what would my quantity be there? 0. I'm moving way far away from that perfectly competitive quantity. So the lowest possible price I could set here would be a price of 30, right? So if we're regulating these natural monopolies, maybe a rule of thumb you could think about, where was I setting that price? Where the demand curve hit the... So when I set price, demand is just a bunch of combinations of price and quantity. So when I'm setting the price, profits will be equal to 0 when that demand curve is equal to my average total cost, right? That point where demand hits average total cost, that's the lowest possible price I could set because that's where profits would be equal to 0, okay? And then over here, it's a similar example. I'd love to lower the price to 40. That would drive the firm out of the market. So the lowest possible price I can regulate this to would be where average total cost hits my demand curve or at a price of 50, right? I've minimized deadweight loss. I haven't eliminated it completely, but I've got it as low as possible without driving that firm out of the industry. Okay. So once again, pattern recognition goes a long way. If you see two questions that look pretty similar on both these practice finals, I would imagine there might be a question that looks like this on the final exam. What do you, oh, so yeah. So if that's the case, we actually wouldn't have an example of a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly is the idea that given the current demand and the cost structure, it's only enough to support one firm. So we actually won't end up at a point where that could occur. So that you'll never see a depiction of that essentially. Yeah. To not get too lost in the weeds and take time on stuff that wouldn't show up on the exam. Yeah. 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 So module 10, we're looking at question 2. Start me out. Oh, practice problems. Module 10. So we're looking at here. Yeah, so this is actually a very similar one that ends up on the practice exam. I think I changed the question slightly, but it's a similar depiction. So if I'm looking here, is this the one you're talking about? So if I'm maximizing profits, module 10, we're back to looking at perfectly competitive firms, right? So in the short run, what is the firm's demand curve, or what is the firm's marginal revenue? It's simply the, so if I have a perfectly competitive firm, yeah, it's the price, right? I can't get away with charging anything different from the price because our products are homogeneous. Someone would just buy it from somebody else. So this completely horizontal curve that represents marginal revenue, essentially that's my firm's demand curve, right? They have to set this equilibrium price so that becomes their marginal revenue. So where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? Quantity of 20. What is true about my price relative to average total cost? It is less, right? I didn't say this is the price, but you know that a perfectly competitive firm, their marginal revenue curve is simply the equilibrium price. So the price in the market of 30 is below their average total cost at that profit maximizing quantity. Profits will be prices below average total cost. Profits are negative. So I have a second decision to make. What is that? What do I have to decide? Do I stay open or shut down? So my price here, is it above or below my average variable cost? Above. So if price is above my average variable cost, I actually minimize my losses if I stay open. We only shut down if the price falls both below average total and average variable cost, right? So in this scenario, price would be above average variable cost, so I would still stay open and produce those 20 units, okay? So when I'm thinking about in the short run, they're going to produce a quantity of 20, but in the long run, what quantity are these perfectly competitive firms going to choose? Well, in the long run, right, if profits are negative, what starts to happen? Some firms begin to exit the market. As they exit the market, so we can kind of think about why this occurs, just kind of a little bit of a almost review. But if I started out with a scenario and I've got, here's my initial price and marginal revenue curve, here's marginal cost, here's my average total cost curve. Where did this price come from? So this was what the firm was facing, right? Well, that price came from the market. So, close enough, right? So I've got this equilibrium price. That was the firm's marginal revenue. Now, even if in the short run, that price is above my average variable cost, I'll stay open, but because price was below average total, some firms will begin to exit the market. As firms exit the market, what happens to the market supply curve? Fewer firms, the market supply will. This is where it's not cumulative, but we have to know if we have fewer producers, the supply curve will decrease, right? So let's say supply decreases, right? And pushes us to this new equilibrium price, right? So as firms exit the market because of negative profits, the price will increase until the new point. So if we think about before, this was like the quantity of the firm. At this higher price, well, intuitively, when prices are higher, firms will choose to produce more units. Even though profits were initially negative, in the long run, they get driven down to where profits are equal to 0, right? So in the long run, we know that firms will exit. It's going to push that quantity up. So here, where will the long run market stop? If profits are negative, firms exit until the price goes up to where profits are 0. If profits started out as positive, firms would do what? If you see positive profits being made by selling something, what do you want to do? Get involved in that market. So firms would enter. That would, if profits were positive, increase supply, lowering the price, pushing profits down to 0. So in the long run, with these perfectly competitive firms, we know we always get driven down to the point where profits are equal to 0, right? In fact, not only do we know that they're going to get driven down to 0, just so that we have maybe a little bit less going on to really highlight this. In the long run, the point where profits are equal to 0. So first of all, something I had drawn in here in the short run is going to go away in my long run depiction. It doesn't really go away, but it won't show up visually. In the long run, what's true about my average variable costs? It's my average total cost curve, right? So what will happen in the long run? The only point where profits are equal to 0, and I could do this if I wanted to, draw in all these hypothetical prices. The only point where that price or marginal revenue will result in hits marginal cost that results in 0 profits is going to be that price that's exactly equal to the minimum point of our long run average total cost curve. Okay. So we know in the long run, where will the perfectly competitive firms end up? Well, they eliminate fixed costs. The average variable cost curve starts to increase until it perfectly matches average total. And we know that where profits are equal to 0 is always going to be in these perfectly competitive markets at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So where does the perfectly competitive firm end up in the long run? Producing 30 units. Okay. So in the long run, the point where profits are equal to 0, which is what firm entry and exit will always do in a perfectly competitive market. They push long run profits to 0. What other market will firm entry and exit always push profits to 0 in the long run? Monopolistically competitive markets. Now it'll look a little bit different, but with perfectly and monopolistically competitive markets, profits get driven down to 0. Okay. So in our perfectly competitive markets, that's at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So that's why the long run quantity would be 30 and not 20. Okay. If I were instead to add in an additional question here, in the long run, what would my average variable costs be for this perfectly competitive firm? So I think about, okay, I know they're going to be at the minimum point of the average total cost curve. What I wouldn't want to do is then simply go down and say, okay, I have this depiction. Average variable cost looks like it's what? About 29, right? That's not my average variable cost in the long run, right? This is a depiction of the short run. Why? Because there is a difference between average total and average variable costs. In the long run, I know my average variable cost will be the same as average total. So in the long run, my average variable cost will actually be equal to 38, the same as my average total costs. Okay, so that's another question that you could be asked there, is to, in the long run, identify what would the value of your average variable cost be, the exact same as your average total, and in the long run, you know it'll be at that minimum point. Okay. Any other questions on that one before we keep moving? So I have one other thing that might pop up on a question that is counterintuitive that might be good to know. Okay. And this is where, especially once we get to like monopolistically competitive markets, we want to read carefully if we're thinking about the market level or the firm level. So what happened to the quantity that each firm produced as these firms were exiting the market? The remaining firms, they will actually produce a higher quantity. What happens in the market, though? This is kind of counterintuitive. As firms exit, what actually happens to the market quantity? It goes down, right? So moving from the short to the long run, it could be positive profits to zero or negative profits to zero. In this case, we start out with negative profits. Firms exit. The market quantity is going to go down. But of the firms that remain, demand hasn't changed. So each firm is actually producing more units, right? So that seems counterintuitive, but like, if I had 10 times 5, so 10 was the number of firms, 5 units, it's 50. If instead I have 3 firms, they're each producing 12 units, now I only have 36. So the number of units per firm went up, but the number of total units in the market can go down, right? So that we want to make sure we're making a distinction or being careful when we're reading these about the difference in the quantity at the market level and the firm level. Moving from the short to the long run here, we saw that each firm is producing more units, but the market as a whole has a lower quantity. Okay. All right. Saw a hand up somewhere over here. Yeah. Yep. So number 4. So we're looking at this one. So same depiction that we just worked through on 2, right? We actually just worked through it, but it's in the exact opposite order, right? In our example, we said that firms were going to exit. So if instead firms enter this market, what would happen to market supply? It's going to So if I've got more firms, right, what's going to shift? So here is my old equilibrium price. As firms enter this market, supply is going to increase, right? More firms, I'll see my new supply curve be higher. If there's more firms, there's more competition. What happens to the price? Gets driven down. What is the price for this firm? So what was the second part of the question? What happens to profits, right? So let's just think about, we had this scenario. So here is our initial price. That is the firm's what? Perfectly competitive firm. The equilibrium price is their marginal revenue, right? They can't get away with charging any other price than that. That's how much they're making off each unit. So let's assume that we had an example where it looks something like this, just to kind of make the point here. At that profit maximizing quantity for the firm, what is true? Price is above my average total cost. So what are my profits? Positive. If firms enter that market, that, let's say too many firms enter, right? It lowers the price. This is now the firm's marginal revenue curve. Where is the new profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So the quantity each firm produces is actually going down. And what happened to profits? Price is now below average total cost. So now my profits are negative. So if they went from being positive to negative, the directional changes, profits have decreased. Now, they could still be positive in both scenarios, but I drew this out extreme to kind of show you they're decreasing, right? They could, in fact, not just be a smaller positive value. If too many firms enter, we could go from having positive profits in industry to having negative profits, right? I would argue this happens in a lot of like fad industries, right? Where things become popular and people try to mimic them. We then have way too many people selling them. What now happens? Well, if there's negative profits, now the correction is that some firms are going to exit until profits are back to zero. And there's no incentive for any more firms to exit the market. Yep. Any other questions on this one before we keep moving? Any other questions people want to see work through? Yeah. 28. Yeah, so it's basically thinking about making these short versus long run decisions. Now we're looking at monopolistically competitive firms, and we've got a word problem instead of a graph, right? So I've told what the quantity is, marginal revenue, marginal cost, average total, average variable cost, and the price, right? So what are the firm's profits going to be? So 27 and 28 are similar. I'll work through them to kind of show you like basically how you would solve both, right? So you don't have to have a graphical representation of this, but I'm going to draw one to kind of help us out along the way. So this is where on every question for the exam, what do I suggest being able to do? Draw something out, right? It'll just help lead us to the correct answer or rule out answers that don't make any sense at all, right? So a monopolistically competitive firm looks very similar to a monopolist, right? Right? On its face, it looks no different. So how are they going to set the profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. In this problem, we're told that's at a quantity of 10, okay? We are then told their marginal cost and marginal revenue value are both 32, okay? We're then told that the current price is 52 and the average total cost is 58. So if I were to draw this out, I know that my average total cost is somewhere here above that current price, right? Okay. Now, if I didn't have this graph, I could still use the equations to kind of reason my way through this, right? Our profit equation, if we stay open, whether or not profits are negative or positive, if we stay open, our profit equation is what? You take the quantity we're producing and you multiply it by the difference between how much money I'm making per unit, how much my per unit costs are, my average total cost, right? So here, price is below my average total cost, right? Not even from the visual, just the numbers given to me. Price was 52, average total cost was 58. So what is going to be true about my profits? Negative, right? Price is below average total, so if I calculate profits here, they would be negative, right? Now, if I go ahead and do this, let's see what my profits would be. I have what? 10 times 52 minus 58. So I'd get what? Negative 60, if I'm doing math in my head correct there. Now, this might be right, but because profits are negative, I actually need to check something else. If profits are negative, I need to determine in the short run, do I shut down or stay open, right? If I shut down, what do my profits become? They're simply negative whatever my fixed costs are. And then we said, okay, how do I find fixed costs? It'd just be the quantity I'm producing times the average. I usually am not given that information. How can I find average fixed cost? It's just the difference between my total and variable costs, right? My averages. So how do I determine whether or not I shut down? That's if my price is what? Less than my average variable costs. So here the problem told me the price was 52, and in 27 the average variable cost was 45. So I should in fact not shut down, right? I should stay open and my profits would be negative 60. Now, I can almost prove this to myself every single time. Let's assume this firm did shut down. What would their profits be? Well, the quantity would be 10. The average total cost we were told was 58. Average variable cost was 45. So if I do shut down, my profits would actually be negative 130. What's better? Losing 130 or losing 60? Losing 60. So I made the correct decision when I stayed open because price was above my average variable cost. Okay. Now, you would work through 28 the exact same way. I think the only difference there is I changed the price to, instead of being 52, I changed it to being 38. So if instead, so here, where would my average variable cost curve be? Somewhere here. And I was told the value was 45, right? This was question 27. If all of a sudden something changes here, so the demand curve, let's just reason through this. If instead, for some wild reason, firms entered this market, what would shift in this model? The costs that the firm faced would be the same, but they're now sharing the same overall market demand with more firms. So their individual firm demand curve would actually decrease, which would push the price lower. So let's say incorrectly firms entered this market and they pushed the new price all the way down here, right, to 38. We could go through the same line of thinking. If the price is now instead 38, will profits be positive or negative? Still negative. But if the price is now 38, is it above or below my average variable costs? Below. So instead of staying open, I should choose to. Now I can go through the same kind of thought experiment. If I stayed open, now the difference between price and average total cost would be what? 38 minus 58 or negative 200. If I shut down, well, do I have price here? No, if I shut down, I didn't change your average total or your average variable costs or the quantity. So what are my fixed costs? They would be the exact same value. I'm facing the same cost structure. The only thing that changed that price was the fact that the demand curve of the firm was shifting. So now if I stay open here, if I stay open, I lose 200. Whereas if I shut down, I'm still only losing my fixed costs, right? What's better? Losing 130 instead of losing 300, right? Which ultimately, I don't have to do this every single time. The shutdown decision is simply, if the price is below average variable cost, I should be shutting down. If price is not above average variable, or sorry, not below average variable cost, I should choose to stay open. Okay. Now I forget who had that question, but does that answer any other questions on anything I went through here? Okay. Any other questions people want to see worked through here? So this one? Yeah, so we did one at the start of class here. Let me see. Instead of switching off here, maybe I'll do it this way. Just to save time, maybe for some more questions, right? So how did I say we should solve these models? Yeah, starting out kind of with the second person first. So the second person's decisions are on the right? I'm writing these in order. I'm not trying to confuse you. I'll be specific when I write this on the exam and tell you that person two's payoffs are on the right. But I'm never going to like all of a sudden switch that to, you know. So if firm one chooses to produce 40 units, what should firm two do? Well, they're comparing 250 to 300, which is higher. 300, so they're choosing to produce 30 units. So I would cross this out. I know that won't happen if I'm on this branch of the tree. If firm one instead chooses to produce a lower number of units, what will firm two do? produce a higher number of units. So I know this won't happen, right? So now knowing that, what will firm 1 do? Well, if they produce a high number of units, firm 2 will produce a low number and they end up with 400. If they instead produce lower number of units, they know firm 2 will always choose to produce a higher number and their payoffs would be 300. Which of those is preferred? Well, if these are representing profits or revenues, well, here I want the higher value. So what is my Nash equilibrium? Firm 1 produces 40, firm 2 produces 30 units. Okay? And if it were me and I had the exam, I'd do the exact same thing I'm doing here with this tool. I'd scribble out what I know can't happen, right? Once I solve for firm 2's decisions, now firm 1 is really not comparing all 4 of these options. They're only going to be comparing these 2. Okay? Now, would this be an example of a prisoner's dilemma? Is there any other combination where both firms are better off? Would they both be better off with 250? No. Now here, one firm is better off, but the other is worse off, so no. And then over here, this firm would be better off, but the other firm is. There's no other combination where both of them are better off, so we would not have an example of a prisoner's dilemma. Okay? Did that answer? Any other questions that people want to see work through here? Yeah. Is it possible to have 2 Nash equilibrium? So if I have multiple Nash, in the games that we're looking at, it would technically be possible. But I wouldn't ask you a question where we have multiple equilibrium combined with a prisoner's dilemma, right? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Hmm? So in relationship to what? Quantities, prices? Yeah, so I think what you're asking, and this might be helpful, and you could draw these every market out and it would result in this. So there's maybe an easier way to think about this using kind of a couple timelines. Okay. So I'm going to first do things at the firm level. Okay. If I'm thinking about the firms, who is going to set perfectly competitive, monopolistically competitive, or monopolies? Who is going to face the highest demand curve? Well, if I'm in a perfectly competitive or a monopolistically competitive market, I am one of many firms. So I'm only getting a portion of demand. If I'm a monopolist, I face the entire demand curve. So what is likely going to be true at the market level is that monopolists actually choose the highest quantity because they're selling everything. They're the only seller in that market. Now, relative to a perfectly competitive market, if I have some monopoly power as a monopolistically competitive market, what am I going to do? Any monopoly power should result in higher prices. How do I get those higher prices, though? I have to restrict quantity. So relative, here, we're talking about the firm level first. So relative to a perfectly competitive firm, monopolistically competitive firms are going to restrict quantity, right? But the monopolist, because they face the entire demand curve, they'll kind of have the highest quantity. Now, this is at the firm level. If we instead were thinking about this same thing, but we're looking at the market level. So at the market level, who is restricting quantity the most? Who has the most monopoly power? A monopolist. So what market is going to have the lowest quantity? A monopoly market. Who is going to have the highest quantity? Well, who restricts quantity the least? What market has no monopoly power? Perfectly competitive. What market has some monopoly power but not complete? Monopolistically competitive. So the market is a little bit more intuitive. It's when we look at the firm level, it gets kind of weird that the monopolist ends up with a higher quantity than both, right? This relationship is still the same, but the monopolist kind of jumps to the front because they face the entire market demand curve, right? If you're thinking about visually, like here's the market demand, even if we had a constant marginal cost, the monopolistic competitive firm is going to face a demand curve that's way down here, right? So the monopolist is always going to be having the highest quantity at the firm level, right? Now at the market level, it's a little bit more intuitive. All you have to think about is who has the most monopoly power. They're going to restrict quantity the most. So, right, if we're just thinking about kind of directional changes here, we would have something that looks like this, okay? Now, here's where it doesn't matter if we're looking at the market or the firm. In terms of the price, everything is the same. So price is a little bit easier. We can kind of use intuition. What happens with a monopolist? Monopolists restrict quantity in the market, which ends up with having a higher market price. So who has the highest price at the market level? A monopolist. And this will be true of the market or the firm, right? Where is there no monopoly power? Perfectly competitive. So they're going to end up with the lowest price, whether or not we're thinking about the market or the firm level. And then who has some monopoly power but not complete? Monopolistically competitive markets, right? So if we're just thinking about like kind of directional changes of prices and quantities, you can kind of summarize it kind of with like a timeline, or it's not a timeline, but like a line where you kind of plot these points. Is that what you're asking? Yep. Oh, sorry. Also, if you're worried, unlike previous classes, Tuesday's recording and today's, I've got the .cam kind of recording. I didn't do it for the other ones to incentivize class attendance. Here, a review, I want to give you guys more available kind of resources to go back to as you're studying for the final, okay? All right. Any other questions we want to see? Oh. All right. I don't know how to get rid of my draw tool. There we go. So 16. Okay. So this is a concept that'll kind of pop up, I think, in like even on 17 and 18 a little bit. So if we're thinking about a monopolist, what is always going to be true? Okay. So they face this downward sloping demand curve. And you could draw in any marginal cost curve here. I'm going to draw it constant just to make it a little bit, I think will help with this. So they make a decision based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Let's assume, which we know this isn't possible, but let's assume that the firm had zero marginal cost, right? That's impossible if we have implicit cost because there's always going to be the cost of time, right? But let's just assume that it was. If I had a constant marginal cost down here, what quantity would I choose? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. If marginal revenue is equal to zero, what portion of the demand curve am I on? Unit elastic. Now, we know that costs have to be something, right? So just using zero as a hypothetical, even if we had zero marginal cost, we know the monopolist would be on the unit elastic portion, but we know they're going to face some level of marginal cost, right? Costs have to be something. So where is marginal revenue and marginal cost going to be equal? It's always going to be at a quantity for the monopolist where marginal revenue has to be what? Well, if marginal costs are anything, marginal revenues have to be positive, right? So if marginal revenues are positive, what portion of the demand curve am I always on for a monopolist? The elastic portion, right? Now, if we had a monopolist or a perfectly competitive market, or we had a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, we could actually end up at a point out here. So I'll kind of make this point. Why is this the quantity that a perfectly competitive market would choose? Where does a perfectly competitive market end up at? Where supply is equal to demand. What represents supply? Marginal costs. So the perfectly competitive market could end up here, in which case, what's true about my marginal revenues? They are negative. So with my perfectly competitive market, I can end up on the inelastic portion of my demand curve. Okay? I don't actually have to go through and calculate my elasticities. As far as I would ask you is if you know that the marginal revenue at that quantity is positive, which you know it has to be for a monopolist, we know that the demand is going to be elastic. Now, in some of the other examples where I give you like tables and you actually have to calculate marginal revenues, it can be that if I had negative marginal revenues, which we know a monopolist setting a single price never would, but a perfectly competitive market could have negative marginal revenue, we could be on the inelastic portion. Now, who else could technically be on the inelastic portion of the demand curve? If we had a monopolist, and they're not setting a single price, but they can perfectly price discriminate, what does their marginal revenue curve become? The demand curve, right? So for a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, marginal revenue isn't this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, right? Their marginal revenue curve is simply the demand curve. So if for a price discriminating monopolist, notice what quantity do they actually choose? The same quantity as a perfectly competitive market. So with a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, what is the value of deadweight loss? If we're at the perfectly competitive quantity, that is where total surplus is maximized. So deadweight loss, if I can perfectly price discriminate, is equal to 0, right? And in fact, that perfectly price discriminating monopolist can also end up where marginal revenue, if they were to set a single price, would be negative. So the price discriminating monopolist can also end up on the inelastic portion. It's not always the case. They can also end up on the inelastic portion. But for a single price monopolist, they'll never end up on the inelastic portion. It'll always be the elastic, right? So I know this one's kind of a little bit weird and counterintuitive, but you see a question like this on the second practice exam. I think it's question 18, right, where I give you a table. If you're looking at a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, their marginal revenue curve is the demand curve. So that's how you find the quantity they would choose. So just to make this point, because I think it's worthwhile, if I had this table, it was question 16, sorry. If I had a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, I wouldn't look to see where marginal cost is equal to my marginal revenue. So I'd have to calculate my marginal revenues here. I think if I do this real quick, without taking too much time here. So marginal revenue is the change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity. So I think I end up with, I think I did something goofy here just to, this is 5, this is -1, this is, nope. I'm looking at the wrong, this is -1, -3, -5, right? So if I'm a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, I'm looking to see where does that constant marginal cost of 3 equal the demand curve? Well, the demand curve is just the combinations of price and quantity. So where would that constant marginal cost hit my demand curve? At a quantity of 35, right? So that constant marginal cost of 3, what quantity would I be at on my demand curve at that value of 3? It was a quantity of 35. So I set the quantity as a perfectly price discriminating monopolist based off of where that marginal cost hits the demand curve. However, to determine if it's inelastic or elastic, I look at the marginal revenue as if I was setting a single price. That's what tells me about the elasticity of the demand curve. So when solving for the quantity of a price discriminating monopolist, we simply find where the marginal cost hits our demand curve. But then at that quantity, well, here, this is kind of easy because like, if I know the quantity is 35, I know that has to be the right answer. So let's say I gave you something like this. Why do I know I'm on the inelastic portion of the demand curve? Because at that quantity, if I was to set a single price, marginal revenue would be negative, right? So it's a little bit weird with price discriminating monopolists because you find the quantity based off the demand curve, but the twice as steep marginal revenue curve is what tells you about the elasticity, okay? Now, if they were setting a single price, you find the quantity based off of where the twice as steep marginal revenue curve hits marginal cost, and you based off your elasticity based off the value of that twice as steep marginal revenue. So it's a little bit easier with those. Okay. All right. So given just kind of where we're at time-wise, before I kind of let you guys get out of here. So once again, if you have questions prior to the final, try to get them to me sooner rather than later. I will be keeping an eye on my email throughout the next few days and trying to respond as quickly as possible as I see emails come in. Other than that, my advice, I've got 2 practice exams out there. If you see similarities across those 2, those are probably really good questions to be able to know how to solve, right? Other than that, thanks for a great semester. I wish all of you the best of luck. If you have any other questions until now to the final, reach out. Otherwise, good luck with your other finals. Good luck studying, and I will see you on Tuesday.